VP engineering and hopefully helping them on their own leadership journey. And hopefully that cascades through. And as you said, I run some courses at the Tech Lead Academy as well. So that's a little bit about myself.
Great, yeah. And once again, happy to have you here. So let's jump right in. As we've kind of talked about this in the past, we wanted to break it down into a couple key components. So we'll actually walk through those. But the first thing I want to really touch on is, let's talk about that initial transition. Like, what do you do during those first 30 days to really successfully move into leadership?
Great question. So I'm picturing myself, in an organization, and let's say that you're a really senior technical person, and somebody has asked you to suddenly lead a team. I think that's a sort of big shift. And so those first 30 days are really critical. I think the first part of understanding, how you're going to lead your team effectively is trying to understand what is expected of you. I think one of the challenges with leadership roles is people assume you're going to do the best. And it's often around those sort of implicit expectations that you'll do whatever is most important for your team, but nobody will really tell you what that is. So, the first step, I think, is really trying to explore the boundaries of, what are the things that you can do to add the most value. For some teams, it might be about making sure that there's a strong technical vision and architecture direction to make sure that people understand how to make good technical decisions in that approach. Part of your role might be coming into a team that isn't working so effectively. And so part of your first 30 days is trying to get a sense of maybe what are the team smells or process smells that are holding the team back. If you've inherited a highly performing team, maybe your role isn't about changing that team, but maybe working with the rest of the organization to sort of clear the path or think through, dependencies or things that the team needs that people can't necessarily get access to or don't have the time to get access to. And so that first section is really thinking about, what does your role look like in your particular context? This is one of the challenges, is that it changes over time. And so you'll have to work out what you're going to do to add the most value in those first 30 days. Now, particularly if you were an individual contributor, like a technical person, developer, stepping into this role, there's a second thing that I would recommend for you in those first 30 days. And this is really about realizing that your role has changed over time. So I think when most people go into their first leadership role, they kind of expect they're going to be doing the same things, right? So if I'm a developer, maybe now I just get to make more complex decisions, and maybe I'm getting involved in those decisions. But actually, there's the side that, once again, nobody tells you about, which is actually sometimes the right thing to do is not get involved in every technical discussion, because you might quickly find yourself becoming a bottleneck. And so this is another sort of side of trying to work out where you're going to spend the time and how your role is going to be very different from what you're doing. Now, for a lot of first-time people that have never, ever done a leadership role, that may mean actually you're going to have very different skills that you've never really needed to draw upon. So you might be talking to people in your business, people from customer service teams, management people that you've never really had to communicate with before. And you're going to have to learn to talk using different words, a different language, because they're not going to necessarily understand all the frameworks or the technical jargon that you would be used to talking to in your team. And so there's going to be some sort of interesting skill gaps potentially of you drawing on things that you never have had to use in such demand before. Thinking about risks, thinking about all the potential things that might go wrong so you can actually take proactive action instead of reacting. Really managing your time, for instance, and thinking about where's the most valuable place that you have the most impact, given that you're going to have way more work than you can possibly do as well. And so that would be my other tip for that sort of initial 30 days, is really trying to get a lay of the land, trying to understand how you're going to add the most value, shape that role, understand the expectations of people around you, but also recognize that your role itself and what you're going to do is going to change, and therefore your skills are going to need to be different. And in some areas, you may need to actually be rapidly building some of those skills while you're using them, which can be a very stressful experience.
No, I love that. And, we typically talk about, ramp time is like this 30, 60, 90. And I think one of the things you really called out really, really well is that the big theme I got from that is to almost like slow down and take it one step at a time during those first 3 days. we all have this desire to get quick wins on the board, but it's so important to know what wins actually matter. And it's okay during those first 30 days to say, we're going to take some time to figure things out. And business isn't the same as it was prior to me joining and being on this role. So I like that a lot. And I also definitely the recognition that those things will change. This is definitely not a static thing. Once you figure it out, it's always going to be the same. I love that you kind of draw attention to this, is that every engineering team is different and is going to be going through different things. You may have one team that's super connected to the customer, feels very connected to the value they're bringing, but maybe struggling in another area, and a team that is vice versa. And so you have to really understand where to fit that in. One question I'm going to add for you, which I didn't warn you ahead of time, I think a lot of us, our first entry into leading a team is most likely leading the team that we were on. And that's obviously this gap, a gap from obviously all the skills and things I'll be doing, not being a bottleneck, things we talked about, but also, my colleagues are now my direct reports. Tell me, how do you build rapport, gain their trust, and during that transition?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you touched upon something, which is this sort of shift in relationship. Is that I think when people, when I've seen people who've been in a situation where they've been colleagues and suddenly they're now leading or managing other people who were their sort of peers, there's a sort of shift. For some people, that shift won't be big, but for other people, it's a huge change and difference. So people will look at you different because of your role and your title. And the fact that, you have this reporting line. And so I think the worst thing you could possibly do is just ignore that and pretend that you're going to be working with everyone as if you were their peers. You do have a different type of responsibility and accountability to your organization. And also you have a certain level of decision-making power, which means that there is this sort of difference in imbalance. So I think it's healthy to recognize that. And then also to understand that, whatever you say or whatever you do is going to perhaps be interpreted differently than what you were when you were as a peer. And so this is where, if you're not recognizing that sort of relationship shift, when you say something off the cuff, you might find that some people in your team interpret that to mean a direction or a demand, like this is what you want, right? You might have been just brainstorming some idea, let's use React, let's use Vue, and people might interpret that as, okay, now we have to use React or we have to use Vue.js. And so understanding that your words and your actions have more potential to be interpreted with more authority, it's important, because you can't necessarily be just sort of not thinking without how you're going to react. And so you have to be a little bit more deliberate about how you communicate, how you act, to make sure that, you're treating people with respect. I think one of the other aspects and tips that I would give people here is, when you recognize this difference, you have different roles now. So you have different demands on your time, you have different expectations. And so it doesn't mean that your role is suddenly to tell everyone on your team what to do, but really to help understand how do you work well with those people, given that you have different expectations and things that you have to do. So, part of your role as a technical leader might be making sure that, there's good plans ahead of the team. So technical roadmaps or planning. That may mean that you're away from your team some of that time to go talk to other people in the business to gather information. Other people might suddenly think, you're, skipping out on important meetings. You're not writing as much code, right? And so you have to help them understand, your role is expected to do some of those activities. And so, because you haven't been part of sort of meetings, it's completely valid that you might need to ask questions to get context about what's happening. And so a good way to do that is to talk to people about their preferences, learn out what's important to them, and to see if you can sort of come up with a working style that works for all of you, adapting to their individual styles. Now, because teams are made up of different types of people, you'll have to go to each person and actually talk to them one-to-one to find out what their own personal preferences are as well. And so, when you're in that sort of situation, definitely build up that trust, spend the time to listen to people, to help them understand that your role is now going to be different, so that relationship needs to change, but be open and invite them to provide suggestions about what's the best way to work together.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. Let's see if we can. This may be a while for you, Pat, but like, let's go back to that first transition for you. What do you remember as being your biggest singular challenge making that transition?
Just one.
Just one.
No, so for me, I remember it was very stressful, right? Because I got asked to lead a particular team. I think I had a lot of personal respect from people, which is one of the reasons why I think I was formally asked to lead this team. But then suddenly part of leadership is kind of deciding what you want to do. Now, when you're as part of a team, you typically have, a shared backlog. It's kind of clear. You pick up the next kind of work item. There's a very structured process. And, I think one of the things that added to that stress when I first stepped into that role is, am I doing the right thing? Like, nobody told me what I should be doing differently. I'm not getting as much feedback. I'm now, instead of just another developer in the team, in this unique role, I don't know if I'm actually doing things in the right sort of way. And so, I put a lot of pressure on myself because I wanted to do that role well. But, that creates a lot of different stress points for the person in that particular role. And so this is one of the reasons why I want to help support other people going through that transition, because, when you're a developer, you can often reach over to another developer and bounce ideas off them, right? Pair programming is great for that, when you can talk about the same sort of problem. But when you're in this sort of leadership role, sometimes it's difficult to talk about certain topics. Let's say that you have two people in your team disagreeing about a technical approach, right? You have a responsibility to try to help resolve that, but you don't necessarily want to maybe talk about that discussion with other people in the team, because people might feel that they're being talked about or, not being disrespected. But you still need to be able to debate and understand what that is. And so you might need to find peers or a support network around you to be able to talk about situations, to explore potential options about how you might sort of solve that, or even just simply get ideas and advice from people who've maybe been through that before. And so that's something that I wish I had when I first stepped into that role, because it feels like, oh my goodness, like you have to bear the entire weight of all these problems from the team and solve them yourself. And I didn't realize that there were options of asking people, maybe not directly in my team, but peers in my own organization, or people that I've met in industry, at meetups, at conferences, to sort of ask advice. The great thing about today's world of sort of remote is that there's a lot of engineering communities as well. So, it doesn't even have to be in person. There's lots of Slack communities where people drop in questions about, I'm in this situation, how have you dealt with that before? And so I think it's really great to be aware that those support networks are out there, but make sure that you use them as well. So for me, the big stress thing was like my biggest challenge of managing that, trying to get sort of feedback about what I'm doing right, am I on the right path, and also managing that personal stress. That was a huge challenge for me, for sure.
Yeah, so big takeaway, if you're stressed, you're probably not alone in that at all. I want to actually, there's actually a great question coming in for the audience. I think that's really pertinent. And it says, the question is, how do you manage leading folks that are older than you? Please give pros and cons. I'm going to expand it a little bit, because we say older, but that could take multiple forms. That could be more tenure. That could be maybe a proficiency in a certain area. But basically, it's like people who are perceived to have more experience than yourself.
Great question. So in my consulting days, I remember working for an organization. This was really fascinating organization. They developed their own programming language because they'd been around for 30, 40 years. And as a result, all the people working in that programming language had a lot of experience, but only in that programming language. And I remember being introduced to the tech lead of a particular team, and they introduced me to this person called Simon, who was the newest person to the organization. I was like, oh, how long have you been with the organization? He said about 5 years, right? So newest. And a lot of the other people in that organization have been with that company from the very beginning. So, they'd been around for 30, 40 years. Simon, I think, was probably in his late 20s, leading a team of people who were sort of in their early 40s with way much more experience than he had, particularly in that domain and in that sort of programming language. But the thing that he was able to add was a different set of skills. And so this is is the interesting thing in order to answer the question of when you're leading other people who maybe have, and I'll call it different experience, your role isn't necessarily to tell people what to do, but to think about how you can complement them. So one of the interesting things I observed working alongside this team is because this team and this company had been sort of siloed off for a long time, they didn't seem to have a lot of knowledge about sort of what I'd call more modern engineering practices, right? So refactoring, test-driven development, continuous delivery. And so from that sort of side, this is something that Simon, who was the technical lead, could actually understand. He came in with a different outside perspective of helping people understand there are new concepts that may help those people. He doesn't need to tell them how to write code in their own programming language, but maybe there are practices or things that they can learn as a team and that he can nudge them towards that will help them improve the environment. And so I think in that sort of a sort of situation, I would go back to this sort of question with, as a leader, what are you doing to multiply the effectiveness of everyone in your team? When you're dealing with very experienced people, it's not often about telling them how to solve problems. They've often got that. It's often about the things that they don't feel that they can solve themselves, right? It might be negotiating dependency with another team because they don't have a good relationship or they don't know who to talk to. You as the leader can help connect them or to influence other people in the product roadmap to try to get that dependency so they can get their work done. In most organizations, there's, you have the things that you can control and influence. And as a leader, it's often about working in the organization. So taking care of maybe organizational bureaucracy so that everyone else can focus on, value added work. That's definitely something that, good leaders do, which is trying to sort of streamline the work from that sort of side. So I think there's a certain sense of when you're leading more experienced people or people with very different experience, the interesting question is, how can you add value by complementing them, adding in your own strengths, and working with them to help them work more effectively as a team?
I love that, and we all know that we all came into leadership to handle bureaucracy. Like that's our favorite thing on the world to do. But this is a great segue. Because one of the big topics we want to talk about was moving from this idea of you're a maker to being a multiplier, and you kind of really teed that up well with talking about how to complement. And so one of the things this is actually personal to me as well. Some of the feedback I've got early in that kind of transition was, hey, you're not trying to build clones. People are going to solve problems in a different way, and that's what you actually want. And so the question I have is, how do you create that collaborative, that progressive team, the team that probably can operate without you, without micromanaging their day-to-day?
Yeah, this is a really hard challenge, I have to say. Like I always struggle with this anyway, but I've had a lot of practice of trying to get there. I think a lot of us who particularly come from a development perspective started off as this maker. And one of the characteristics, I think, that when you're in this maker mode, you get the satisfaction out of solving problems yourself. As you said, coming up with the elegant solution of writing code and coming up with this working feature, having impact with customers. There's something about that creation process that's really fulfilling and exciting. And that's where, the transition from maker to multiplier is so essential as a mindset. And so if you're going to help people on that sort of, help yourself in that sort of transition, part of it is sort of thinking about what you're doing if you're operating in the right mode. So, if you're, as a technical leader, taking on a feature and a story, you're probably going to be in maker mode, right? That's completely normal. But when you go and interact with your team, you really need to make this almost mental gear shift of saying, okay, I'm now putting maker mode on pause. I now need to think about how do I help people in that sort of team. And so, as an example, early on in my career, before I sort of thought about this maker versus multiplier mindset shift, I would be tempted when somebody came to me and they said, hey, Pat, I've got this problem. I have this challenge. And as a maker, your instinct is to say, here's how you solve it, right? Like you want to be the person that has the right answer that gives people that sort of buzz. There's something fulfilling about that. But, people will go off and do that. But have they learnt themselves? Have they actually come up with that solution? Have they got the satisfaction? They have some information, but have they really learned something deeply? Probably not. And so I think this is where, when people are coming to you, spending a little bit more time explicitly thinking, can I coach them rather than give them answers so that they can find the answer themselves? Can you lead them perhaps to the answer through Socratic questioning or coaching? And people will not only be more satisfied because they've come up with their own answer, but you've also helped them grow on that sort of path. And so I think that's definitely a habit that is very useful, of sort of stopping yourself from automatically giving answers, because that's that sort of maker mode, and almost like literally thinking, okay, now I'm shifting into multiplier mode to ask, okay, what can I do to help them discover the answer for themselves? Another tip that's often helpful here is trying to be clear about the outcome and not worry about the solution, right? So often we talk to people about, here is how you break up a problem, and they allocate tasks. What's most important, if you're really thinking like a multiplier, is you want that outcome solved, and you have to be prepared that people will solve it in a different way, but your value is defining what that outcome and what good looks like.
I really like both of those concepts there. And I think that's one thing I learned as well. I mean, there's kind of your inclination when someone comes to you with a problem is to train, to coach, to teach. But what I have learned is that there is a broader impact by providing your team with more what I call at-bats, more opportunities to go and do, versus trying to transfer knowledge. And so I think I like that. And obviously there's going to be some boundaries. And I think the way you do that, like you just said, is what is the ultimate outcome that you're trying to coach towards. And I love that as a way to do that. We're getting a lot of great questions. So we're actually going to take a moment and actually kind of go through some of the questions of the audience, because those are always more fun than what we come up with ourselves. But there's actually a few here. I'm going to read a couple of them. They're kind of in this related area of, I'll say, competing priorities, which I think is pretty inherent to this role as a first-time leader. And so I'm gonna kind of read a few of these. So Laura asks, how do you manage the different and sometimes competing expectations on you from different areas? For example, architects expect more time on design, owners expect more time helping, figure out requirement implementation. We've got devs expecting you to unblock their issues. And then another one as well, this is kind of more on a personal nature, is I was recently asked to take on too many responsibilities simultaneously. I was going to be the tech lead. I was a semi-product manager, an individual contributor. Have you ever had a similar situation? And how did you manage expectations and carve out the right role for yourself? Now, I kind of believe those are kind of similar questions, and maybe you want to answer them separately or kind of tackle the overall concept.
Yeah, they're great questions. They're definitely related in terms of lots of things to do.
Right.
And I think the first thing, or maybe not the first thing, but things that I've learned through maybe overcommitment is that there is always more to do than you have time for, right? And that's true for software development teams. Product people will always come up with new features. It's also true for leadership roles. And I think the hard part of this is, as a maker, you've never had to say no to people before, right? You normally have some sort of development process. You estimate, other people take care of what gets maybe prioritized out or in. And so that's one of the habits that you're going to have to develop when you're in this role of sort of learning how to find some system that allows you to say no, or maybe no, not yet. And then think about what makes sense from that perspective. I want to tackle the second question, which was around the, got lots of responsibilities. How am I supposed to do things from that perspective? One of the mistakes I remember making very early on in my career, in my technical leadership journey, was treating myself as a full-time developer as well. So, as we were doing capacity planning, estimation, sprint planning, whatever you want to call it, I counted myself in as, yeah, I can write code just as much as everyone else. That's not the case, right? So I often say that, if you're a tech lead writing as much code as a developer, you're probably forgetting about a whole bunch of other things that you should be doing, but don't have the time for. And so it's definitely helpful up front to acknowledge your value-added activities mean that you're going to have to spend time on other things, right? It may not be obvious to you, but you're going to have to spend time talking to other people in the business, navigating the organizational bureaucracy, as we talked about, code reviewing, doing lots of things, even just having time for yourself to think and plan and prioritize its value. And so, I like to give a rule of thumb that if you're a technical leader and you're writing code, don't estimate yourself at more than 50% of what everyone else would be doing on your team. You have lots of other things you should be doing that add value. So that's definitely one aspect of trying to manage that time, of trying to recognize you have lots of other things to do, make sure you have some time in advance and you're not overcommitting yourself. The other sort of aspect.
I'll just say, like, I love that you brought in the numbers, because I think it's a good thing for people to kind of listen to. Like, what is the boundary? It's like, what does good look like? I was told 40%. And so like, reduce your individual capacity by somewhere in that range, at least half of your capacity is now gone. And that is obviously contributing. That's individual, maker capacity that's now dedicated to making an impact on your team. And that needs to be a really critical first step. Like, day one, I am no longer going to be doing the same thing I was doing yesterday. So thank you for kind of bringing the numbers in that one.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome. And, depending on in that last situation, which are the roles, I think if you can almost create a model of saying, okay, you've asked me to be product manager, tech lead, and individual contributor, I'm maybe going to split my time, a third across each of these activities, right? And so if you can quantify that and create a model, you can help manage other people's expectations is, if this is a large team, each one of these things are probably full-time roles. I won't have the time to do all of them, so I'm only going to have to spend a third of these time. So that may mean that either things aren't going to be done as well, or things are going to take a little bit longer. So that would be that one sort of approach. The first one around lots of responsibilities and competing priorities. One of the things that I think, at least how I'm interpreting that question, comes down to sort of expectations. And so what often happens is, if you're in a leadership role, people come to you for what they want, right? It's natural, right? There's a leader, I go talk to them. And what you end up having is you're kind of balancing each person's expectations, and you're the only person that sees all of these competing things that maybe contrast one another. And so one of the things that I encourage leaders to do is to sort of build systems that bring in all those expectations and create visibility of them. This is one of the reasons why sprint planning and iteration planning can be so useful, is when you have different stakeholders together in the same virtual room talking about what they need, it suddenly becomes clear, okay, well, if we spend half a day working on the deployment plan, that's not half a day spent on the architecture planning for this new product feature, right? And so it's less about you and your own personal preferences and what people sometimes call politics, but it's really just about balancing out the needs. And so, to address that, I would encourage thinking about what are the systems that allow you to highlight everyone's needs to bring them to the same place, but be clear about how you prioritize some of that. Normal ways that people do is actually defining, standard ways of working, right? So this is one of the reasons why the agile sort of development frameworks are a good starting point, is that it says, okay, if you want new requirements, that's where sprint planning is good, right? So we try to freeze things so that we're not constantly interrupted throughout there. And so anybody who has things, anybody who's part of that meeting can get visibility as to what we're committing to or what we're not committing to. And that's the place where we all share the same information. If you have people constantly coming to you throughout on a daily basis, it's easy to say yes, but then by saying yes, you're kind of implicitly saying no to somebody else at some point. And so it starts to feel like more personal favors, even though you're trying to do the right thing.
And this is a core kind of elementary part of like team building foundations, right? So when you come in, the first step is like, hey, I am now in a position where I have to say no. I have to protect my team. I have to provide air cover. One of the things that's worked well for me is taking an inventory. And like we mentioned, this is first 30 days type stuff. What are all the expectations? And there's going to be things, and actually even going one layer, say, architecture is maybe a domain. Going into that domain, like, what are the actual things? And then really understanding and prioritizing on that list. Like, what are the things I'm going to do? And typically, best practices to take that down to like 10. What are the 10 things that we can actually support as a team, and what falls below that line? The benefit of having that line is that now you communicate that, you make agreements across your leadership team, across your direct reports. The benefit of having that line is now I have a built-in kind of mechanism for asking for additional resources. So something comes in before that line, under that line, this becomes high priority. This is something that the organization wants to do. I'm now set up to say, hey, this is great. I need X in order to accomplish this. Whether that's an actual headcount, whether that's a resource from a team, you now have a framework for really saying this is a way, and actually I want to say yes, but here's what we need to do in order to do that. And so now you have this way to say, to be a lot more objective in the way you kind of handle those I'm going to say yes to this, say no to this. And we're going to talk more about, I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about how data can help with that near the end of this conversation. But I think that's something like really good thing to kind of call out.
Yeah, I mean, I think you picked up exactly, and what you described, it's like you've picked the Kanban work in progress limit. We have no more than 10 items. For some other teams, it might be a time box of we have only this week. Like there's only so much work we can do in a week, and that's why I think like that smaller number, be it 10 or a week, is always better. Because I think as time expands, people always think, oh, you can always achieve more, right? Whereas if you have a small number, and it's pretty clear there's only so much we can do this time, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so there's kind of this kind of current as well, kind of going through the questions, and I think I'll kind of ask a couple questions here, but like it's really about, and I think there's kind of two camps here, and that is, do you keep your technical skills up to date, or do you let them go? I think that's going to be a polarizing answer, regardless. Maybe we can talk about some principles, but maybe how to evaluate how you want to approach this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you actually said the key word there, which is principles. So I know in our industry, there is a lot of pressure to always feel like we need to keep on top of the latest tool, framework, library, programming language, and things like that. But I think what I've learned over my career, so I started programming in Perl, don't tell anyone, moved on to doing some C and Java. I've done .NET, C#, Kotlin, some iOS, Objective-C. But, at the end of the day, a programming language is relatively similar. So your first programming language is like very complex. But when you look at the next programming language, you have most of the same constructs, right? You have loops, you have functions or methods, you have modules or classes to contain them, you have things that allow you to organize them. At the end of the day, you're learning syntax, which you still have to Google on Stack Overflow or whatever for whichever random language that you're using. But a lot of the underlying principles still stay the same. And so, I think if you focus on understanding those principles and go back to that question about how can you help your team, there are a lot of things that you don't have to worry about keeping up to date with the latest sort of flavor of technology. You can always learn the syntax very rapidly. There's lots of katas or things that you can do to understand a new programming language. But, trying to understand, for instance, principles of distributed architectures, of trying to build in resiliency, of trying to, come up with modules with good responsibility, high cohesion, low coupling. These are great principles that transcend any type of programming language if you're, and any type of application if you're trying to build a desktop client, a web application or not. So from that sort of side, I think there's the principles, and then, the interesting question is how much of your role demands that you need to be sort of hands-on building things. Now, there are some technical leaders that I know that, still want to build features, right? Because, there's maybe they're working for a startup and, they don't have so much organizational bureaucracy. They can actually spend time working on the product. And so, for them, they might make sure that they're picking up a feature at least once a week. So they're keeping a sense of what's going on. I would say if you're also responsible for the technical direction of your particular system, so some technical leaders may be more engineering managers, more about people and process than about the technical architecture. But if you're responsible for the technical architecture, it's still important to still keep up to date with the code. So in those situations, I recommend that technical leaders spend at least 30% of their time with code. That may often be more reviewing code, right? Because it's often easier to spot code smells, architecture patterns, and to see if there's like a divergence between your team. And that often means that you might need to, sit down with your team, have a discussion about maybe which preferred pattern that you like, make sure that that becomes the sort of team way of doing things. And so I think the worry starts to, once you start to learn these principles, yeah, it's going to take you maybe a week or two to come up to board with a new sort of programming language, but you still will be able to design good applications if you keep to those fundamentals. So that would be my recommendation, is that, focus on the principles and they will outlast any framework or library, particularly if you're doing with JavaScript web frameworks, any longer than the actual syntax or whatever library or tool that you're using.
Yeah, no, that's such a great answer. I want to kind of double click a little bit. We spent most of the time talking about people process here today, and we didn't want to kind of dive super far into the technical side today, but there's a couple of questions here. And the one is I definitely want to highlight something you said about code review. Not the sexiest part of our job, but we actually went through a study and found that we could actually improve the ramp time of new engineers by about 3 months by simply providing more exhaustive code reviews. In fact, I think it was 42% more code comments and like 30% more words in the PR review comments led to new engineers ramping up faster. So there's a dual value here. You're going to stay closer to the technical side. Obviously, the point is to stick close to the principles, but also it's a value to those new engineers, which typically is about a fifth of your team, helping them ramp up sooner. And so I think that's it. We don't want to pass over that without kind of emphasizing that. But I have a question on the technical side. I think we've all been in this scenario where whether it was a mandate or shiny object syndrome, we put in a technology and we had to rip it out 6 months later. I think we've all been there. Like, what could we do differently to better kind of evaluate those types of things? Because I think we're always going to have engineers who want to implement something different, which is a good behavior, to be clear. But how do you keep an objective lens during those scenarios?
Yeah. So firstly, thank you for sharing that stat as well. I hadn't heard about that, and that's really fascinating. I could totally see onboarding developers a lot quicker with code reviews. So that's really fascinating. But to answer your question, I think one side of that is trying to trying to phrase it right. Think about I've gone mental blank. Would you mind repeating?
Yeah, it's about like how can we kind of watch out for technologies that we may have to rip out 6 months later. We may get a little over ahead of our skis a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's hard to be objective in software because we're all humans, right? So I think acknowledging that that's there. But I think there's two categories of situations I tend to think about in my career. One, which was we're doing something because we want to, and we're using that to justify that tool or technology. The second category I'm thinking about is we're making a bet on something that we think is going to add and solve a problem for us. And I think one way that we can help be a lot more objective is, as technical leaders, is creating a lightweight process of when people are making a significant architecture decision, of trying to spend some time to at least discuss and record what that decision is, right? So, if we're choosing to use this framework because we believe, I don't know, it'll simplify the speed of how we'll be able to build new features, that's a theory or a bet that we're making, but we're making a decision based on that goal. There's some concepts called lightweight architecture decision records, which allow us to document what our decision was based on what we're trying to achieve. And so if we're not very good at actually articulating what that purpose is, then anybody can come along later and say, oh, who made this decision? It just feels like a personal preference. Whereas if it's different, when we say, actually, we thought about these problems, we looked at these different solutions, we thought, okay, we think this is probably the best out of what we evaluated. Maybe a year later, there's a better alternative. At that time, maybe that wasn't there, right? Or maybe we didn't know about that alternative. At least there's that sort of record. And so I think going and thinking about that lightweight process, it doesn't have to be very complex. Some people prefer, using RFCs or request for comment documents as a way of saying, here's a problem, here's what I'm thinking, and here's what I think we need to do that. At least there's a little bit of a treasure trail of thinking that often gets lost in time. And if you don't have that, then any decision that you have and you need to pull out later looks as if it was just a personal decision or the wrong decision, right? So yeah, that's how I would approach that.
Oh, I love it. A couple comments, I think, from people, which would be nice. One said, hey, had to drop for a meeting, but just want to say thanks. This is great stuff. The other one is definitely someone who kind of upped on your comment. It says, correlated, not scheduling 100%, coding capacity, only do what only you can do. The temptation to step into coding is strong. You must expect it and resist. And that's definitely going to be the case. I love that a lot. So kind of veering back towards people, and actually maybe more individual now, how do you manage your time and energy? And I'm going to say, you can expand this beyond just your work hours in this question, but like, that's obviously, you mentioned how stressed you were at the beginning. How did you overcome that?
Yeah, with a lot of help. So I think one when I think about one of my early sort of instances where I was leading a team, when I get under stress, I get kind of a little bit antsy and I start to raise my voice. So sometimes gets interpreted as shouting. And one thing that was very useful is actually getting feedback is that, hey, Pat, starting to notice you're raising your voice. Is everything okay? And it was like a visible indicator that, my stress levels were going up. So I think one thing is trying to make sure that you have some mechanisms in place so that you're aware that maybe you're starting to get overloaded and you manage that sort of time. For me, over time, time management is something that's very personal. And so it's worth finding what productivity systems work for you. I think it's worth experimenting, talking to people around, what they do, and then practicing to see if that makes sense. For me, one thing that works for me is, I need sort of focused thinking time on important topics, right? It might be about thinking, what am I going to do to convince management we need an improved headcount? Or maybe it's about, I need to really get that team to help us with this resiliency issue or this data quality issue, because otherwise our service is going to be affected. How do I start that conversation? There's topics that you're going to be thinking about that nobody else in your team is probably thinking about because you're thinking a lot further in the future. And so you need that sort of focus time. And so I like to book that time out in advance to make sure that there's blockers in my calendar, because if you don't, calendars typically fill up. And then you're at the end of the day and go, oh, I have all these things I need to do. And you feel pressured to work in the evenings and the weekends. Whereas if you have that time in advance, it makes sense to then, you'll have to say no, or maybe next week to something that you might have said yes to. The other tip I want to sort of share in this sort of area, because I could just keep going on about this, is learning about what your energy flow is. So for instance, for me, when I'm doing one-to-ones with people, I tend to get very emotionally drained at the end of that. And so I'm not going to be a great deep problem thinker on topics. And so I typically try to schedule one-to-ones or conversations with people where I believe it may be intense, or at least have the potential to be towards the end of the day, so that at the end of that, the only thing I'm doing is maybe admin tasks, right? Scheduling meetings or responding to emails. I'm not tackling deep topics. So I try to keep that sort of deep thinking time for when my brain is fresh, or at least where I feel my energy is, which is typically the morning time.
Yeah, I think that's this important one to call out. And you make it maybe sound like, hey, you're having these intense conversations, for some, dramatic reason, but really just having that coaching time, whether it's, even if it's a mundane week, is still draining, and it still requires that kind of that really focused energy to kind of get through it. And I love this concept of, it's wise to kind of think about the cadence of your day and how you structure that. From personal experience, I don't think this is new to anyone here, but like, if you're not intentional about your week, it will become, someone else's. I typically go about a week or two ahead and block out time. It just has the natural effect of reducing some of the meetings that were put in there for, they're opportunistic, I would say. And so you definitely need to be intentional with that and think kind of a little further ahead than people who are trying to come at you. Which is a great comment. So we have a lot of really good questions. I'm actually going to go through it and probably just do some rapid fire on this one, and then kind of go, so there'll be no thematic connection now. We'll just kind of go straight for it. So across the spectrum of teams, from dysfunctional to highly effective, what specific leadership gaps do you see most frequently? Is there a punch list of biggest bang for your buck areas to evaluate first? So this is more looking on the dysfunctional side of like, okay, we've talked about all the positive things. Let's go call out some of the negative things that you see most often.
Ooh. So probably, given that teams can come in many different formats, the short answer here with the biggest dysfunction or the biggest problem would be if somebody is managing or leading exactly the same way. One of the keys I look for in experienced technical leaders or leaders is that they should be able to adapt their style depending on what that team needs, right? So if you're in a really chaotic, dysfunctional team, sometimes that might mean being more directive about making sure that there is clarity and structure quickly. If you're doing the same for a highly performing team, everyone's probably going to turn around and quit because they feel like they're being micromanaged. And so you really need to be able to adapt your style. And I would say those people who don't are going to set themselves up for failure.
Yeah, I like that. This is a question I might have to actually get some clarification from the individual who asked the question, but the question is from Lopez. I'm in a role now where my manager is trying to make me a new TO, which I think is technical owner, but I'm not entirely sure what TO means. I haven't used that. My question is, what is your advice, or what do you do in the past that you do not recommend? So I'm going to take this a little bit, and if you need us to kind of address something differently, like please reiterate, Lopez. But like, say someone's coming to you and expecting you to kind of up level into a new position, a new role. What is your advice in that situation?
Yeah, so it's the first time that I've heard TO as well, so I'm not quite sure what that is. But I think if it's generally a new role, I think it's recognizing there are different responsibilities. So I would probably once again start to understand what are some of the expectations around that. If you're going to be transitioning into that role and you're in a reasonably sized organization, so not just like a one-team company, you probably have people that play that role. And so a good thing that you can do is maybe talk to people who are currently playing that role to understand how do they spend their day, what do they do differently, to try to understand that sort of set of responsibilities that you may not simply be aware of. So that's turning the unknown unknowns into the known unknowns. And then based on your own sort of experience, you probably need to do some sort of mapping of, do I have the skills and experience to do all of those things really well? Or are some of those things going to require me to build new skills, right? So, one transition I see, for instance, is when developers might step into a more product role. And some product roles, for instance, might require a lot more financial modeling, right? Like, are we actually going to build a feature that we can sell? That's a very different skill that no developer I know typically has built, right? And so if you can know what is expected of that role and try to do a self-assessment as to where your gaps are, then at least you can build a development plan on what to focus on to be successful in that particular role. The third and final tip that I would add for this is if you do transition into that role, it's really essential you get some early feedback as well, right? So this is one of the great things about sort of interim roles is it's part of the expectation that you're not going to do everything perfect. And for interims, I would expect that they get really early, regular feedback about, are they doing the right things? Where can they do better? What are the things that they're doing really well already, so that they have a good sense of orientation of how they're progressing and changing.
That's great. I love that. How do you motivate or influence people that are unmotivated?
So I'm going to go back to the Stoics, and this is one of the great things about Stoics. They talk about the things that you can control, right? And that's literally what you can say, what you can do. Everything else, you don't actually have control, even though you may feel like it. And so I like the idea of there's things that you can influence and change, but you don't control. And so I think that's the first thing, is that just because you want somebody to do something doesn't mean they're going to do it. What I always try to go back to is really trying to understand intrinsic motivation. So the science around motivation shows that extrinsic motivation works for a very short amount of time, but the most powerful type of motivation is intrinsic. So people want to do something. Right. There's a couple of different ways to tap into that intrinsic motivation. So developers that I know who see the value in their work, right? They're doing something that they can see a visible impact of changing customers' lives or people's lives. They're going to be more intrinsically motivated because they can connect their work to some outcome. And so, that is intrinsically motivating if you can help people connect to what is the end goal of what they're doing. Another thing that definitely taps into intrinsic motivation is if it's helping that person grow, they're hopefully going to want to do that as well, right? So maybe somebody in your team wants to become a leader as well. And maybe one of the things that you want to delegate to them, they may not want to at the beginning, is, to work with your product manager and planning processes. To them, it's like work. But, if you help them reframe it in terms of, well, this is something that you're going to do when you're in this role, this is a good opportunity to practice without actually being accountable and responsible for it. It's a great learning opportunity that is aligned to what you want to do. And so that's another sort of tip of trying to tap into that sort of intrinsic motivation. And then the final sort of tip around this would be try to focus on, what drives people. And people are driven by very different things. So some people are driven because they like to do good quality work, right? And so if you can understand that is what sort of is in natural internal motivator, that's really great. For other people, so me, for instance, I have a strength of achievement. I need to sort of see something to the end and sort of get a sense of progress or completion. So if I can formulate work in that that way, or if somebody can help me formulate work to feel that success, I'm going to more naturally want to engage in that because I sense this is going to help me get the thing that I enjoy doing and be more motivated. So tap into intrinsic motivation and try to spend some time. And the key thing here is you're going to have to talk to people. You're going to have to learn what their preferences are. You're going to have to understand what they want and what they need. And it's going to change over time. So you're going to really have to spend that time talking to people and learning more about the people that you're leading.
Yeah, I like that we kind of start off this question obviously with a negative, like how do you motivate someone who's unmotivated? But I think you really hit on a couple of key principles that matter a lot in terms of how to build an employee experience, a team experience, within your function. In today's job market, if I'm not happy with my job, it is really easy for me as a software developer to go and shift. A lot of those boundaries are going away. We have low unemployment. And so, why do people stay? And that's really kind of where you're kind of hitting is like what matters most to them. And you'll find is that oftentimes it's the less tangible things. It's the things that are harder to find. And so your job is really kind of is to pull that out and make that a core part of your identity as a team. I like kind of the way you talked about that. We're kind of getting close to the top of the hour. This has been a great conversation. I think questions would go a while yet, which is always a good sign that you are well respected and definitely have some great things to learn. And then Lopez did clarify it was tech leader, not TL, so TL. But thank you for that. And so there's a lot of great questions here. So Josh, I think you're behind the scenes now. If there's any way to like capture these, I'd love to potentially. We typically do a written, kind of a write-up of this kind of afterwards. So everyone has access to both the audio recording, but also like a written version of this. Josh, I would love to take some of these questions and potentially dig into them kind of later with Pat when we have the time. A few of you have asked the question, and I'll kind of end with this to kind of give you a little bit of like context as to why we love these conversations, why we support them, why we continue to have these conversations. And that is really, the genesis of the team I'm on. I work for a product called Pluralsight Flow. Flow was built literally for conversations like this. Flow is an engineering insight solution that connects with your code repos, it connects with your work management software to really help you understand how can I take my high impact team and optimize it and make myself a better leader. We have all these competing priorities. We've talked about it multiple times. Everything that's coming at me, where do I spend my time as a leader? Who needs help? Who needs coaching? Who actually needs to be elevated and motivated and promoted? Which is a big use case for using data and being more objective and more inclusive with how you approach your team. Really is why we do what we do, why we show up to work every day is building this type of tool that allows us as leaders to be much better for our teams. And so for those who want to learn more, obviously we cannot do justice today, kind of in a 2-minute kind of postscript, but definitely check out pluralsight.com/flow, learn more about it. There's an option to get to begin a pilot, to get a demo. Like, please take advantage of that and kind of learn how you could use data to help really kind of ultimately save you time so that you could do what you want to do. And that is build a great team. So Patrick, thank you so much for always being willing to come and join us for these. We love these. I'm certain we'll do this again with you. Appreciate all the questions. I apologize for those we didn't get to. Lots of really great questions here. And so we'll try to tackle those either in a future session or in a written kind of recap of this webinar. But yeah, have a wonderful kind of last day of the week, depending on where you are in the world, and we will hopefully see you soon. So thanks again.